shouted, falling behind. Your legs were not so nimble when you ran at the jousting of the topo, a battle at Topo. Lano, my friend. And then, perhaps because his breath began to fail him, he stopped and hunched against a bush, as if to make himself and its branches one. Behind them, eager as greyhounds off the leash, black bitches filled the woods, avid and quick. They set their teeth on the one who stopped to crouch and tore his limbs apart. So you've got these harpies tearing them apart. And then they took the wretched members away. Then my escort led me by the hand to the bush which spoke, grieving in vain through places where it was hurt and bled. Jacopa de Santo Andrea, it cried, what did you gain by shielding in me? What part had I in your sinful life? Notice the questions, right? My master said, when he was standing above it, and who were you who through so many wounds exhale this blood mixed with sad words? It answered, O souls, you too who arrived to see this shameful havoc crush my leaves and tear them from me. Gather them now and bring them to the foot of this wretched bush. Somehow try to collect some part of me, right? In life, I was of the city, Florence, that chose to leave Mars, god of war, right? Her first patron, and take the Baptist, John the Baptist, when the city became Christian, for which the art of Mars will always make her grieve. In other words, this is a reference to the fact that once Florence became a Christian city, there was a little bit left over of the statue of Mars. And if his semblance, that statue, did not in part remain still at the Arno, she would not survive. It's that little bit of the statue that allowed for Florence to keep rebuilding itself over and over again. And later, when they pitched the city again over the ashes left by Attila, we immediately think of that mythology of the phoenix bird that rises out of its own ashes. Attila the Hun, by the way, burned Florence in 450 AD, right? Over the ashes left by Attila, those striving to refound it would have worked in vain. And I made my own house be my gallows. I'm hanging on my own gallows here in the afterlife. Pinsky, Robert Pinsky, our brilliant poet, the translator, has in the end of this volume provided an amazing little essay in the endnotes that I want to just read with you. I'm on page, by the way, 325 in our volume. Canto 13 begins with a series of negatives, he says. The images in the opening lines are of what is not. The leaves not green, earth-hued, the boughs not smooth, knotted and crooked forked, no fruit but poison thorns. And this list of negatives is itself introduced by telling where Nicias had not yet reached. So that the first word in Italian is non, not. The list is followed by a figure that tells what sort of thicket wild beasts do not infest. And in this moment of the poem, Dante and Virgil penetrate to the region of hell for those souls who violently negated their own being. Think about the brilliance of that. What is suicide? It is a negation of all things that are you. The image in hell, to continue now with Pinsky, the image in hell of the barren sin of despair is a dense abundance, a forest of anti-life with earth-colored foliage and contorted limbs, a wealth of lifelike non-matter. In other words, that in its luxurious vigor is both more and less alive than the life we know on earth. Despair is soullessness, and the shades who after judgment will display their lifeless earthly bodies from the limbs of these trees appear less like living people than souls elsewhere in the Inferno. It's a brilliant insight, the ways in which Dante portrays these shattered souls. The suicide abdicates from reality, maims the soul by wounding the body. In this circle appear souls whose dealings with others have been just, not cruel in life above. And their having been just, which wins them sympathy, emphasizes the magnitude of the sin of destroying the soul. In the final lines, an apparent digression about Florence twists back to this truth, like a scorpion's tail. Florence abandoned Mars as patron and took John the Baptist instead, for which the city has always suffered bad fortune in war. Though the remnant statue of Mars at the Arno still ensures the city's survival, rebuilding itself after defeat, that sentiment, pagan in itself, turns into a Christian parable of endurance, courage, and patience in the last line, where the doomed shade's total self-destructive despair is contrasted with the courage of those who rebuild over the ashes. In the Augustinian scheme, St. Augustine, of course, from Confessions. In the Augustinian scheme, despair is a terrible sin, denying as it does both man and God. Well, it's compelling poetry. Let's work now at level 2 and 3. At 2a, well, for the suicide, consider this. For the Romans, suicide was an act often of courage and courageousness, right? You came to the end of your life. You showed your final act of freedom by taking your life. All of that shifted, however, when Christianity began to become what ultimately it became, first in Rome and then the rest of the world. For Christians, in Christian theology, taking your life is a cowardly act because you give up. You resign. You say, there is nothing left anymore worthy of my soul. And in that process, an act of cowardice. Another major message is, never give up to despair, right? You will regret taking your life in the afterlife. Because then and only then, note the genius of this idea for Dante, then and only then, once you've taken your life, do you realize what your life was? That your life was so much more than the despair that you felt at the time. Of course, another major observation and message here is, take care of the resources that have been given to you, both your body and your soul, and your other resources, your financial ones as well, because together they make you so much more capable of living a life that you can be proud of in the end. The symbolism here is compelling, right? The suicides, think of it. The suicides wanted to escape, so in their afterlife they become a tree which is planted randomly, grows up a wild plant, but then is destroyed as well, right? The irony, of course, is that suicides are trying to escape, and they end up this fixed thing, this tree, that's going to be destroyed over and over again, and the body ultimately hung on it. At 3a, we've already mentioned, of course, that Polydorus in Aeneid 3, 22 through 48 is playing a very similar kind of game. Notice that the Greeks hated suicide. Ajax, Jocasta, Antigone, all of them, of course, committing suicide in tragic ways. The Greeks did not see this as a courageous act. The Romans, on the other hand, because of that Stoic philosophy of Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, as we talked about in earlier lectures, they saw the act of suicide often as a final act of freedom. The one thing that you can do in the last moment is to show that you are free. But then Christianity, through St. Augustine and others, of course, will make the argument, no, if you believe in a soul that is a part of the body, then you have to believe that that soul longs to live, to survive, to do, to grow. And therefore, you cannot exterminate that. Of course, we will be studying Hamlet's famous to be or not to be speech. Hamlet calls it self-slaughter. Oh, that this too solid flesh would thaw, melt itself into a dew, or that Providence had not fixed his canon against self-slaughter. In other words, Hamlet says, I would kill myself if it wasn't for the fact that it's clear that canon, Providence, God, has said, you can't kill yourself. It's against the rules. It's a cowardly act. Dante as poet, well, this is powerful poetry, isn't it? I think made even more so because Dante the poet was exiled himself, was accused of things he was not guilty of. So I think when he comes to Canto 13 here, it's very personal, I think, for him. As a politician, notice, he makes a compliment about Florence. This is what makes Florence an amazing city. It continues to somehow find a way to survive and not to quit, not to give up. Dante as philosopher, of course, is making the observation that suicide is a form of giving up and therefore is a cowardly act. He will not agree with the Stoic philosophers who say it's an act of freedom, but rather it's an act of despair, so that in your afterlife, your soul turns into a tree and your body hangs on it after the final judgment. Compelling. Of course, at 3b, this is a compelling question, of course, and a compelling reading, a time that you despaired and how you got through it so that you could convince yourself, I gotta keep going no matter what. I cannot quit. I cannot give up. We think of REM's, the great band's music video. Many of you have said that even though it's an old video, Everybody Hurts is a compelling statement of why you shouldn't give up. Because we're all in this thing called living our lives together. We're all in this together. And, of course, taking a life is a ripple effect that's communal in its power. And this is one of the insights of Dante here, that when one dies from taking one's own life, one has removed so much from everybody else in the world. I challenge you to watch the video, if you haven't seen of REM's Everybody Hurts. Consider again, one more time, at 3B, how suicide is always a communal act. Notice, I wanted to escape, the speaker says. I didn't realize the compelling, challenging realization of what I was doing to my soul. Well, that's Canto 13. That's some heavy stuff. There's no question. This is some seriously powerful poetry. From here now, we move into Canto 14, Circle 7, Round 3, and we're going to get into some more controversial stuff. We're going to have the blasphemers, we're going to have the sodomites, those who are engaged in sexual perversion, as Dante will call it, and then finally, the users, those who will use money to make money, and for some reason that's constituted as unnatural and immoral. Well, we'll have to talk about that one. Come back. I hope that this stuff is compelling for you, and I hope that you can find a reason to keep fighting and stay alive.